So Reverend Todd Eklof has been the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Spokane since 2011, and where he's appreciated for his mind-altering sermons, his compassionate soul, and his social activism. And Todd wrote this, but I'll tell you that's true. Reverend Todd started in the ministry as an ordained Southern Baptist minister, but left the Christian faith while still in seminary as a young man, explaining, "I simply outgrew it." He then began a 16-year career in TV news and corporate video production, during which time he became a Unitarian Universalist in 1988 and re-entered the ministry as such in 1999. He began serving the Clifton Unitarian Church in Louisville, Kentucky until 2011, and then he came to the church in Spokane. Reverend Todd is widely appreciated for his environmental and gay rights activism, and in addition to that, engaging in the areas of criminal justice reform, restorative justice, the peace movement, as well as immigration and racial justice. Reverend Eklof has 2 undergraduate degrees, one in philosophy, the other in communications, a Master of Arts in Religious Studies, and a Doctor of Ministry. He is also a certified member of the American Philosophical Practitioner Association and recently founded NAUA, the North American Unitarian Association. He and his spouse have 2 grown children and 2 canine companions, Chester and Wiley. And please join with me in welcoming Reverend Todd.
Thank you, Penny. It's actually so good to worship with you again, even if it is across the continent. What a wonderful age we live in today that we can join each other in this way. I'm really honored to be part of your worship service this morning. Greatly appreciate you having me. I do apologize that I'm a bit of a tightrope. I'm hearing a little bit of an echo here. Maybe that can be corrected. If not, I can tolerate it. There we go. Thank you, Paul. I think. So yeah, I'm a little bit tight today. I have 2 services coming up right after this, starting at 12:15 your time. So I may not be able to stay much longer than when your service ends, but I do hope that I have an opportunity to spend a little more time with you downstream. So as for my sermon, I want to begin with an unusual take on Western philosophy that is entirely my own. I know of no other philosophers who have said anything similar and can't think of any who would agree with me. To the contrary, I imagine that most philosophers would strongly disagree, which probably means that I'm wrong. So nonetheless, my thesis is this: much of what has long been considered and taught as philosophy emerged in reaction against philosophy and should be considered its antithesis. So I don't want to go too deeply into this provocative claim right now, yet to understand the history of liberalism, which our liberal religion is rooted in, and historical resistances to it, it is helpful to know how frequently and continuously it has been countered by the emergence of illiberal schools of thought that have overshadowed and stalled its promise and its progress. Nevertheless, these illiberal and antithetical schools of thought came to be included among the many ideas that we now count as philosophy. The very first of these anti-philosophers was none other than Socrates, who for many is counted among the greatest of philosophers. I can hear the entire philosophical world shrieking at the very suggestion that he of all people should not be considered a philosopher. Yet the demarcation between Socrates and what philosophy was considered before him is made clear in the teachings of philosophy itself. Every philosopher before Socrates, the originators of philosophy, the first philosophers, are called pre-Socratic because of how significantly Socrates diverged from them. The early philosophers, beginning with Thales of Miletus, born in Asia Minor roughly 2,600 years ago, were the first thinkers that we know of who attempted to explain how the world works in natural rather than supernatural terms. Using math, astronomy, and experimentation, Thales and other pre-Socratic philosophers came up with elemental, atomic, evolutionary, and heliocentric theories about nature and the universe. They discovered things like musical octaves, irrational numbers, meteorology, certain medical breakthroughs, and scientific experimentation. This is why Aristotle, a student of Plato, fondly referred to these earliest philosophers as physicoi, the physicist. So extraordinary and unprecedented were they that philosopher Bertrand Russell once said the rise of Greek civilization, which preceded this outburst of intellectual activity, is one of the most spectacular events in history. Nothing like it has ever occurred before or since. Most importantly, for our purposes here, is to understand that for these early philosophers to have discovered so much, they had to believe that they could. They had to believe, that is, in their own human agency and in their ability to reason. They had to believe they did not need the gods, nor authorities, nor dictums to understand the world, but that they could figure it out for themselves. And it is this positive attitude towards human agency and human reason that is the seed from which liberalism sprouts, rooted in its first principle, universal human dignity. And this is not to suggest that Socrates was anti-human. He was clearly a very wise and thoughtful figure whose ideas deserve to be considered and put into practice. He is to be contrasted from the early philosophers, however, because he turned away from their focus on physics and matter. Socrates turned his interest inward. Know thyself, he said, and the unconsidered life is not worth living. While still a young man, he turned his attention away from physics to ethics because of the former's fruitless quest to know reality, which he called a waste of energy, when the far more important question is how one should live goes unanswered. Socrates didn't want to understand the natural world, but wanted to achieve moral excellence and to know what it takes to live a good life, a happy life. In this sense, he might better be considered a therapist or a self-help guru than a philosopher. Plato, who introduces us to the historical Socrates in his early writings, and later uses him as a rhetorical device to espouse his own ideas, diverged so far from the pre-Socratic philosophers that he discounted the natural realm altogether, claiming that a non-physical realm of perfect forms ought to be considered the true reality. Despite this idealism, which has nothing to do with the thinking of the first philosophers, Plato remains a household name, though most would be hard-pressed to name a single pre-Socratic philosopher. About 15 of them. After Plato, the great Aristotle, still in the 4th century BCE, who righted the ship again by emphasizing physics and reason. Historian A.C. Grayling begins his chapter on Aristotle by saying if Aristotle were alive today, he would be a scientist and most likely a biologist. He'd have a lively interest in scientific method and logic. Like the first philosophers, Aristotle, the creator of formal logic, the principles of which have lasted to this day, highly valued our ability to reason, so much so that he considered it our defining quality, our species' defining quality. Thus, the secret of our happiness, he thought, is to live up to that thing which is distinctive and definitive of humanity, namely the possession of reason. But after Aristotle, the Cynics, Stoics, and Epicureans emerged and, inspired by Socrates, re-emphasized developing guidelines for living a good and ethical life. Until then, philosopher William Irvine says philosophers were primarily interested in explaining the world around them, the phenomenon of the world, in doing what we would now call science. But as the Roman Stoic Epictetus said, What do I care whether all existing things are composed of atoms or of indivisibilities or of fire and earth? Is it not enough to learn the true nature of good and evil? This again is not to say that cynicism, stoicism, Epicureanism, and the wisdom of Socrates aren't valuable means of coping with life, but their goal of living a good and happy life is entirely different than the pre-Socratic goal of understanding the natural world and how it works. Yet as philosopher W.J. Oates writes, at least in its early stages, the orientation of philosophy was to the external world, outside of our skins. What's going on outside of this unconscious state of unawareness? What is real? What is there? In this respect, especially knowing that Socrates, the Cynics, Stoics, and Epicureans largely avoided the abstractions of the first philosophers, it is fair to say their thinking was antithetical, and it is difficult to understand how two things so different can be called by the same name, philosophy. So I won't go much more into the history of philosophy here, but want to use what I've already said to illustrate what I consider a back and forth between philosophy's original emphasis and its various ideological reactions against it, all of which oddly are called philosophy. Just prior to the Christian era, the skeptics and sophists also emerged, respectively, denied that human beings can obtain knowledge, not even through reason, and that we can therefore use fallacious reasoning to argue anything we wish is true. Indeed, some of the greatest names in philosophy yet to come, Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, Schleiermacher, Nietzsche, and Sartre, rejected reason to varying degrees, which led to 20th century postmodernism that underlies the mindset that many today refer to as wokeism. When Christianity became dominant in the 4th century CE, almost all philosophy was considered heresy in paganism. An estimated 90% of the works of antiquity were destroyed because of this hostility. Imagine 90% more philosophy, ancient philosophy that we could be reading and studying. Gone. Neoplatonism became the dominant mindset, which lent itself well to religion, to a religion obsessed with having the right ideas and perfection in a non-material heaven, rather than with the hard facts of physical reality, rather than with coping with the world on its own terms. The Roman Catholic Church dominated Western society for nearly a millennium until the Reformation weakened its stronghold. That's a 1,000 years, nearly 1,000 years of stagnation, of going nowhere, spinning our wheels. We could have been to Mars already. Once some were able to question its doctrines, however, and challenge its authority, the Renaissance began in the 1300s. Renaissance, which means renewal, was named so for the renewed and rediscovery of interest in the pre-Socratic philosophers. That's what the Renaissance refers to. Those first philosophers, particularly their rational and empirical approach to understanding. With this came a renewed appreciation for humanity, human agency, human reason, human dignity, and a recognition that individuals should be free to determine and express their own beliefs, and that societies must be tolerant of ideological differences. This is the attitude that spread and flourished then during the Enlightenment period in the 1600s and 1700s. The Enlightenment philosophy, rooted in the proto-scientific thinking of the pre-Socratic philosophers 2,600 years ago, can be summarized as a belief in human dignity, which results in freedom, reason, and tolerance. Freedom means every person must be free to think and speak for themselves and to choose their own purposes and meaning in life without prejudice. Reason means that every person has the capacity to think and consider the empirical evidence before them in their pursuit of truth and understanding. Ideological dictums and religious dogmas should not be imposed upon them. Intolerance means every person, regardless of their specific ideologies and identities, should have equal standing and equal access to the benefits and protections of society. It means living peacefully together, even with those with whom we disagree. It's the lowest bar. We don't have to like them. We don't have to love them. We don't have to agree with them, but we have to tolerate them. That's the least we can do. And that is enough to maintain a peaceful world and a peaceful society. And when these are a society's overarching principles, it progresses. When not, it doesn't. We've already seen all that was accomplished, or some of what was accomplished, by the pre-Socratic philosophers once they were able to explore the physical world on its own terms, free from superstition and dogma. Yet after the pre-Socratic era, when philosophical navel-gazing began, followed by the advent of the Holy Roman Empire and its dogmatism, little to no progress was made again for nearly 1,000 years. It wasn't until the Renaissance, precipitated by the invention of the printing press early in the 15th century, that dogma lost its hold. Communication became rampant, and society necessarily became more curious and tolerant as a result. This mindset flourished during the Enlightenment period, 17th and 18th centuries, leading to a century of unprecedented advances in the 19th. As the Unitarian minister John Dietrich, the father of religious humanism, one of my predecessors here in Spokane, put it, it was this movement of liberalism which marks the 19th century as the most remarkable period of human history. In fact, the 19th century did more to add to the sum total of human life than all the other centuries of the Christian era put together. Now, for those of us who weren't around in the 1800s, the Canadian scientist and distinguished professor emeritus at Montego University, Václav Smil, explains it well in his 2020 book, Numbers Don't Lie. Some might think the 21st century has had the most profound inventions in history, but not so according to Smil, because most recent advances have been variations of two older fundamental discoveries, microprocessors and exploiting radio waves, which occurred during the 19th century. In fact, Smil says perhaps the most inventive time in human history was the 1880s. That's when electricity became a household commodity thanks to the invention of thermal and hydropower generation stations that still provide 80% of the world's electricity. It's also when the first electromagnetic waves were discovered, leading to the first wireless communication technology. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, the radio. The radio was the first wireless technology that allowed us to all gather together around the same information, the same communication. It brought us closer. Electric irons, multi-story steel skyscrapers, the steam turbine, coin-operated vending machines, the four-stroke combustion engine, elevators, revolving doors, electric streetcars, electric motors, cash registers, x-rays, ultraviolet light, infrared radiation, microwaves, chain-driven bicycles, and other inventions our lives and technology still depend upon today were all discovered in the 19th century, immediately following the Enlightenment's age of reason. The Enlightenment also led to significant social revolutions. It was the Enlightenment principles, freedom, reason, and tolerance, rooted in human dignity, in our belief in a common humanity, that led the framers of the U.S. Constitution to fashion our fragile democracy. And what happened less than a century later, also in the 1880s? The Civil War. A battle to correct what was not accomplished with the signing of the Declaration of Independence in the U.S. Constitution. They tried to compromise by saying that Black people were only percentage human. That wasn't going to last. liberalism wouldn't let it last. And so the conflict that was put off could not be avoided, ending the scourge of slavery. According to political scientist Francis Fukuyama, this occurred in part because of the Enlightenment's notion that all human beings are equal in dignity or worth despite their evident natural or social differences. And because of this, he says, slaves were themselves becoming empowered through increasing consciousness of their own worth. That's what Enlightenment liberalism teaches us. German philosopher Heinrich Treitschke once said, "Everything new that the 19th century created is the work of liberalism." And Fukuyama says the same is true in general. Historically, liberal societies have been engines of economic growth, creators of new technologies, and producers of vibrant art and culture. This occurred precisely because they were liberal. And this hasn't happened by magic, but because the tenets of liberalism allow individuals the freedom to explore new ideas and to use their own innovative minds to interpret empirical facts in order to discover and create, and to do so in a society that tolerates different and new ways of understanding and being in the world. This is why these are the only principles by which society can make genuine social, economic, and technological advances. Yet each time we get close to establishing a healthy, genuinely liberal society, its antithesis emerges to thwart us. For the first philosophers, it was, oddly enough, Socrates' introspection and Plato's idealism that subjugated them to merely being pre-Socratic, an incidental footnote in the history of philosophy before it really began. Aristotle briefly got us back on track with his emphasis on logic and science, but his ideas were also subsumed by the cynical, Stoic, and Epicurean self-help gurus, along with those who were skeptical of any truth, or that any truth could be known, and those who exploited such uncertainty to make anything they wanted sound true. Whenever materialist and empiricist philosophies emerged, holding that matter or physics is the fundamental nature of reality and that truth is derived from sensory experience, they were met by rationalists and skeptics who argue truth is derived by thought. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, and that it is not possible to know objective truth. A.C. Grayling says, one of the earliest opponents of the Enlightenment itself was Romanticism. The Romantics, he says, asserted instead the primacy of emotion over reason, and accordingly celebrated the subjective, the personal, the visionary, and the irrational. They gave a privileged place to moods and passions as sources of insight and as arbiters of truth. Toward the end of the 19th and the start of the 20th centuries, philosophers like pragmatist John Dewey, logician and mathematician Bertrand Russell, and humanist John Dietrich restored philosophy to its pre-Socratic roots, only to have these sensibilities challenged again with the emergence of postmodernism, the rejection of science and empiricism, and the notion that there is no such thing as objective truth or even a common human nature. All truth is subjective, and any belief is just as good as another. And today's wokeism, for lack of a better term, is but the latest incarnation of idealism, romanticism, rationalism, postmodernism, and so forth, a rejection of reason and empirical experience in favor of anyone's subjective beliefs and felt or lived experiences. In the 21st century, liberalism is additionally despised by conservatism, which seeks to slow or altogether halt progress, and neoliberalism, the belief that government should have no power to regulate or tax organizations. True liberalism, on the other hand, accepts governments are necessary to protect the rights of individuals within a democratic framework. That's their purpose. Hence, nationalism, communism, and authoritarianism are also current antithetical challenges to liberalism. All of this is to say that liberalism is currently in peril, which means humanity is in peril because we cannot live in peace together, overcome our greatest challenges together, or make progress together without the only tools that have ever enabled us to do so, recognizing human dignity, resulting in societies that are increasingly based upon freedom, reason, and tolerance. Today, those on both the extreme right and left prefer to silence and demonize those they disagree with, uplift subjective experience and alternative facts as truth, and are as uncivil toward as they are intolerant of others. This is why liberalism must not only survive, but come to thrive again, because it is the only mindset proven to unite our society and our species in order for us to make the next giant leap forward, so that perhaps some wise person in the future can look back and say of our time, it was this movement of liberalism which marks the 21st century as the most remarkable period in human history. Whether we call ideologies antithetical to liberalism philosophy or not, liberalism is the only ideology that has proven to advance human welfare and individual worth, always trudging against similar currents of resistance that deny reason and physics and objective truths, but succeeds nonetheless, despite renewed political, religious, and social forces that renounce hard reality and scientific facts and that prevent progress. Liberalism has proven to have staying power, and its principles continually recur to bring tangible hope and meaningful improvements to our existence. Today, liberalism is ridiculed, demeaned, mischaracterized by those both on the left and the right of things, and has become misunderstood by most as a result of this negative publicity. Even many of us who are profoundly liberal in our spirits cannot articulate what it means and are reluctant to use the word to describe ourselves and our values. Some of us think it is a divisive word, but its definition and values are easy to articulate and to recall. Liberalism is a belief in human dignity and results in greater freedom, reason, and tolerance. Liberalism is a belief in human dignity that results in greater freedom, reason, and tolerance. If this simple sentence describes you and what you most value, then you are a liberal. And I hope you are, because our confused and divided world needs liberals and needs to become liberal now more than ever. Thank you.